Day 1076 of the Ukrainian War Map, also known as the Russo-Ukrainian War. Juzzie here, and today is another update as I take a simplified and down-to-earth approach to some of the most important happenings on the ground in Ukraine. So starting off, we'll take a look at those Russian losses, as currently Russia sits on more than 841,000 military personnel losses, representing an additional 1,300 losses in the past day. And as for hardware, quite a bit on the list today: 12 tanks, 18 APVs, 51 artillery, 3 air defense systems including a Strela 10 and a Book M3, and even more notably, another oil refinery strike. And a gas processing plant too. So headed straight to the map because Ukrainian UAV one-way attack drones targeted Russia's Volgograd oil refinery late last night and some 500 kilometers from the front lines, igniting massive fires that were clearly visible on NASA's firm's fire monitoring systems. The refinery, a critical piece of Russia's energy infrastructure, has a substantial annual capacity of 14.5 million tons, making for one of the largest refineries in the country, top 5, although that ranking system is always changing given what's been happening in the last little while. Now, as for this particular strike, it was the third time on the refinery, with the previous just a few days ago, and the event before that a smaller yield outcome from many months ago. Videos circulating on social media showed flames raging at the Lukoil facility, with locals confirming that the site was indeed ablaze. Despite Russian air defenses reportedly being active in the area, the drones managed to penetrate deep into this location on Russian territory, targeting this key industrial site. It's a clear message from Ukraine to the Russian MOD that they're capable of hitting Russia where it hurts most. However, I do still occasionally wonder if the Kremlin is receiving the fullness of these types of messages, or is it still getting the cheerful reports of all aerial threats being neutralized? Now, for this event, one such Russian citizen or netizen took to Telegram to vent his frustration in a considerably illegal fashion, as far as Russian laws go, stating on the matter, quote, "Putin is a liar. Where is our Red Army? They are gone. They are lying underground." A little bit critical of the Russian military, I would say there, not the least of which is critical of Putin as well. Then next up on the map, it was Astrakhan, as Ukraine successfully struck a Gazprom gas processing plant in the region, disrupting vital gas supplies to the North Caucasus. Local authorities report that the plant is out of service, with at least 3 drones hitting the facility. Now, while officials claim that minor damage, and quite literally repeating the mandated talking points of debris only hitting the site, the impact is still clear. It's also a location that is a bit above your average UAV incursion distance from the front lines, with this case being about 800 kilometers or 500 miles as the crow flies. And Russia overnight saw a large-scale launch of Ukrainian UAVs targeting various territories. In total, they reported the launch of over 100 drones, with this map that shows the approximate initial route of those UAV flights. The collapse of Russian national air defenses in the face of Ukrainian propeller-driven one-way attack drones in even just the past 30 days has been profound in its scope. It's an uptick or upscaling of attacks that are occurring at rates not seen before, and certainly not on this type of scale. Then into the Ukrainian map today, into Kharkiv, with, for example, another failed Russian assault in the Kupiansk direction, taking out various pieces of armor including a tank. And these types of events would appear somewhat related, perhaps directly, with a local from Russia's Bryansk region, because in an intercepted conversation, that Bryansk resident described heavy Russian losses near Kupiansk, noting that their people go but no one returns. She also referred to it as a meat grinder, and that the situation is completely different to the way the Russian TV portrays the war. It's a real shame for Russian society when they can't be critical of their own military's failings, which is precisely something that would help their army in the first place. Then headed down the map to Donetsk, or really the Donbass, as Russian State Duma Deputy Tsaryrov acknowledged on state-run TV that capturing the Donbass will take years at the current pace, and making it impossible to destroy Ukraine. And take note of that last comment, because they don't even try to hide it anymore. Now, he was also quite specific here, saying that continuing at a pace of gaining 30 square kilometers per day will take a very long time. Now, there is some level of accuracy here, although given that Russia's recent gains included 4.8 square kilometers taken yesterday and 2.5 square kilometers taken the day before that, it falls far short of Tsaryov's 30-kilometer assessment. But even so, I'd like to say a great thank you to this Russian State Duma member for aligning his sentiments in a way that much more closely reflects reality. Much in the same way as my end-of-week land grab updates. You know, the one with the occasional snail. Now, to put some of these numbers into further context, the Donbass, with its 10,000 odd square kilometers for Russian forces still to capture, it will take about 3 to 4 years to do so, and basing that on a more liberal figure of about 10 square kilometers taken per day. Now, as for the rest of Ukraine, it would take a century. After all, it's 500,000 square kilometers left to take. And there is always some nuance to these figures, because the further one projects out into the future, the harder it is to anticipate what will happen, especially with the need to factor in how long each side can sustain their current rate or tempo of operations. Take Russia, for instance, facing long-term economic stability challenges, which is certainly not helped by their demographic decline. Plus, integration of artificially intelligent weapon systems into this battle space will also be a watershed moment. Then further down the map in the Donbass, or in fact, moving across to Zaporizhia. Quite deep in fact, as there were a lot of reports of explosions in both Tokmak and Berdyansk. But as is sometimes the case, there was no opportunity for a photo op, or at least so far, which can certainly be the case when looking at the occupied Ukrainian regions. Then also on the map, somewhere in the east, Russia deployed a makeshift tank, essentially a metal shed on tracks, against Ukraine's 110th Brigade in the southeast of Donetsk. Specifically, this one was struck by the precision of Ukraine's modern artillery. And it also looks a lot like the metallic monstrosity we saw just the other day getting outfitted in the Russian workshops. Ah, the circle of life. More of a half circle, really. Then a brief look at the map for the country of Kazakhstan. That has now initiated oil exports through Azerbaijan, utilizing the BTC pipeline. Now, this is important because it allows the post-Soviet country to diversify its oil export route beyond that of the traditional Russian Caspian Sea, the CPC pipeline. In particular, the Kashagan oil field, one of the largest discoveries in recent decades, sits off Kazakhstan's Caspian Sea coast, with reserves estimated between 9 and 13 billion barrels. So this move could be considered a strategic play to cut Russian transit control, and done so by a whopping 80%, with Kazakh aspirations of sending 20 million tons of crude oil to the European and global markets annually. And by doing so, creating a significant blow to Russia's regional influence and economic leverage in their energy space. Then headed across to some news for today. So French President Macron has announced that France will double its defense budget, reaching 110 billion euros, and done so over 5 years, and thereby increasing their defense spending from about 1.95% at the moment, percentage of GDP, to that of about 3.8% of GDP. This significant investment aims to bolster European military capabilities across 7 sectors, including special forces expansion, military intelligence, drones and unmanned systems, cybersecurity, and high-intensity conflict preparedness, and was so announced, emphasizing the need for unified public and and private investment. This decision not only strengthens France's military, but also signals a push for greater collective European defense readiness. And as far as mainland Europe goes, France is a key player, boasting one of the largest and most capable armed forces on the continent, also being the only mainland nuclear power. So they are in the rightful place to be stepping up as a leader in European defense, asserting their role as a primary provider of regional security. Then to some more news, and as for some negotiation news updates, because in a recent statement, Kremlin spokesperson Peskov insisted that legitimizing Ukraine's leadership is a prerequisite for any peace agreement. And with those comments of his, he also referred to the current Ukrainian government as the Kyiv regime, stating that elections must occur in Ukraine before a deal can be made. And this is certainly interesting because Russia always said they were interested in peace negotiations, but never stated the prerequisite to only negotiate with a newly elected government head. And in fact, they only started this latest rhetoric around December of last year, which is perhaps no coincidence given that the recent US elections had led to further expectations of peace negotiations upcoming. So on this matter, many suggest Moscow aims to prolong the conflict using bureaucratic hurdles to stall negotiations. And let's all not forget the irony here. The call for legitimacy from a regime led by a figure whose presidential term expired back in 2008, but has been in power for a quarter of a century now. So it's a bit of a disingenuous demand, revealing more about Russia's tactics than any genuine desire for peace. Then headed across to a Russian military mobilization blunder segment, because a recent interview with Alexei Ziliev, a former Russian army medic, who paints a grim picture of life on the front lines in Ukraine. After 9 months of service, he deserted, seeking asylum in France, with his account that reveals the brutal conditions and reckless tactics employed by Russian commanders. He describes a battlefield dominated by Ukrainian drones, with Russian soldiers facing an average of 5 drones per man. Now, sent to the so-called liberated territories, he found desolation instead of victory. And Ziliev's criticisms of Russian command are scathing. He likens their tactics to a video game where commanders treat their troops as expendable resources. The so-called meat assaults are met with well-prepared traps from the Ukrainian side, leading to devastating losses for the attackers. He estimates a staggering 1-to-7 ratio in casualty rates, and noting that's not in Russia's favour. And he has plenty more to say, including that commanders treat their troops with utter disregard, often sending them in no-hope assaults. So we see here, this isn't just a failure of leadership of a single Russian commander, instead it's a systemic issue within the military itself, incapable of any real change, especially with the current leadership in the Kremlin. Then headed to something a little bit lighter to balance the load out a bit, shall we? So, seen here is a crew member of the 155mm AS-90 self-propelled howitzer of Ukraine's 117th Separate Heavy Mechanized Brigade, and sitting quite proudly too. Oh, and do note, it's not a stationary howitzer, it's an SPG, it can roll around, so probably a not great of a deal to worry about in terms of the dog's ears. Then headed across to a quick funny to round it all off for today, guys. Bit of a 5-second funny again, so here we go. And as you can see, they are just soaking that loaf in Russian Orthodox holy water, hoping for a small stat bump in holy power. And these types of actions never get old, but maybe they should start different. In fact, yeah, they should start spraying their Russian holy water over the Uralvagonzavod T-90 main battle tank factories, as a means to magically produce more vehicles for their army that actually have some real protective utility to them. Plus, at least that way, the priests will help shed light on the true military bottlenecks their country faces. So that's it for today, guys. Thanks again for watching. Please continue to like, comment, subscribe, and I do hope to see all of you guys there in the next one. Cheers!